The most effective way to undo someone is perfectly silent. It isn't found in the thunder of an argument or the sharp sting of a blatant lie. Instead, this displacement occurs in the quiet, persistent frequency of a whisper, one that slowly thins the air until you can no longer remember what it feels like to breathe deeply. You don't notice the floor tilting until the furniture has already slid across the room. It is a slow, structural collapse rather than a sudden demolition. But how do you reconcile with a ghost that refuses to materialize? Most people picture a narcissist as a loud, mahogany desk braggart who demands the sun revolve around his specific orbit. We look for the noise. However, there is a far more complex figure operating in the gray spaces of our social lives. The individual protecting a profoundly fragile internal structure through the mechanism of covert self-absorption. They don't inhabit the spotlight, they inhabit the silence. And here is the subtle part. They don't wear a crown of grandiosity, they wear a cloak of exquisite sensitivity. They operate under the radar, disguised as the shy introvert, the misunderstood soul, or the perpetual victim. Their manipulation is a masterclass in subtlety, designed not to dominate you by force, but to dismantle your confidence piece by piece. But why would someone choose the weight of the victim over the power of the king? The core need is the same: absolute control and admiration. However, their method is a study in the economy of guilt. Instead of demanding your attention, they fish for it through self-pity or a persona of intellectual woundedness. If you question them, they don't attack, they collapse. It makes the act of identifying their behavior feel like an act of cruelty on your part. Think about the specific type of person they gravitate toward. They are looking for a stabilizer, someone with a high degree of emotional resonance whose empathy is so reflexive it can be mapped and utilized like a resource. To this individual, your kindness isn't a virtue to be admired, it's a functional entry point. They recognize that a compassionate person will feel a sense of duty to solve a problem that isn't theirs. But how do they actually get inside your head? The interaction isn't a punch to the jaw. It is the atmospheric pressure of a heavy sigh. It is the wounded look across the dinner table when you share a success, or the sudden withdrawal of warmth that leaves you scanning your memory for a mistake you didn't make. You haven't committed a transgression, of course, but you'll spend all night trying to fix it anyway. Soon, the relationship becomes a study in hypervigilance. You begin to rehearse your sentences in the shower, pruning away any words that might be misinterpreted as a critique of their delicate ego. You scan their facial expressions for micro shifts in mood, acting as a human barometer for a storm that is always brewing but never quite breaks. The problem is, this isn't just about stress. It is a systematic thinning of your self-trust. The objective of this dynamic, often an unconscious defense of their own fragile ego, is to create a world where your perceptions are perpetually up for negotiation. They don't want to unravel your sense of reality. They want to be the one who interprets it for you. But they don't do it through anger. They do it through concern. An overt narcissist says, "You're crazy." A covert individual lowers their voice and asks with a pained expression, "Are you sure you're remembering that correctly? I'm worried you're overthinking things again." See the difference? It's gaslighting wrapped in a cashmere sweater. When you finally confront them about a hurtful comment, they flip the script with the grace of a practiced performer. "I was only trying to help you see a different perspective," they might whisper, their eyes welling with the injustice of your attack. Suddenly, the original hurt is forgotten, and you find yourself apologizing for the way you brought it up. You start to prefer their version of reality because it is the only one that allows for peace in the household. The covert narcissist doesn't seek to win the argument, they seek to win the authority to define the truth. They don't break your heart with a single blow. They slowly disassemble your internal compass until the only way you can find north is by asking for their permission. Eventually, you begin to play the antagonist in your own internal monologue. It is a subtle shift in the narrative arc of your life. You stop identifying their behavior as an external problem and start interpreting your reaction to it as a personal defect. You tell yourself you are too intense, unreasonably demanding, or emotionally unstable. But how does an observant, intelligent adult find themselves apologizing for someone else's inability to communicate? The answer lies in a recurring pattern where the burden of accountability is quietly transferred. For an individual whose self-worth is as brittle as glass, the weight of a mistake is a crushing pressure they cannot afford to carry. To them, admitting a fault isn't a healthy step, it's a total structural failure. So, instead of taking responsibility, they deploy the most effective shield in the human arsenal, the persona of the victim. But it's rarely a loud, dramatic performance. It is much more nuanced than that. Think about a moment when you brought up a legitimate concern, perhaps a broken promise or a pattern of neglect. In a balanced relationship, this leads to a dialogue. In this dynamic, however, the conversation experiences a sudden, strange inversion. They don't defend their actions, they collapse under the weight of your perceived attack. They recount their own exhaustion, their misunderstood intentions, or a tragic history that makes your current grievance feel small and selfish. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on the hurt they caused you, but on the pain they are experiencing because you dared to mention it. It is a brilliant, albeit likely unconscious, strategy for maintaining equilibrium. You find yourself in a peculiar state of emotional whiplash. Minutes ago, you were the one seeking an apology. Now, you are the one offering comfort. You become a 24/7 fixer, an emotional caretaker for a person who has no intention of being healed. What happens when you realize you are pouring your empathy into a vessel that has a hole in the bottom? You assume that if you just pour a little faster, it will finally stay full. But the void isn't a lack of love, it is a lack of a stable self to hold it. This power imbalance slowly hardens into a permanent architecture. Your needs are perpetually postponed, categorized as things will get to when they are feeling better. You are no longer a partner, you have become a piece of emotional scaffolding, holding up a structure that refuses to stand on its own. But when the victim narrative no longer yields enough attention, the tactics shift into a quieter, colder phase. This is the era of passive aggression and emotional withholding, a kind of psychological Cold War where no shots are fired, yet everyone is terrified of the fallout. They won't scream. They will simply stop speaking. The silent treatment is particularly effective because it weaponizes our primal fear of being invisible. It is a communication vacuum designed to be filled by your own anxiety. By withholding connection, they force you to chase them, effectively solidifying their status as the one who grants or denies your peace. Then come the remarks that feel like a compliment but leave a metallic taste in your mouth. "I'm so impressed you managed to finish that project on time," they might say, with just enough emphasis on managed to imply your usual incompetence. These are precision strikes, disguised as observations. They are designed to keep you slightly off balance, ensuring that even in your moments of pride, you are still looking to them for a final verdict on your worth. But why does this leave you in a state of permanent hypervigilance? because you have learned that peace is a fragile state that can be revoked at any second for reasons you don't fully understand. You become an expert at reading the air in the room, scanning for micro-expressions and the specific tone of a heavy door closing. You are an athlete of the spirit, constantly running a marathon on a track that is always changing shape. The covert narcissist doesn't aim to destroy you in a single explosive moment. They prefer a slow, manageable consumption. They don't take your power by force. They wait for you to hand it over as an apology for being difficult. The most effective cage isn't made of iron. It's made of your own sense of duty to a person who has convinced you they are too fragile to survive without your total acquiescence. The most profound tragedy is the slow thinning of yourself. This is the phase often described as devaluation, but in the covert context it feels less like a demotion and more like a gradual starvation. In a healthy partnership, your growth is a shared victory. However, for an individual whose stability depends on being the most special or sensitive person in the room, your expansion feels like their erasure. They don't launch an overt campaign against your success. They simply refuse to offer the oxygen of acknowledgement. But why would someone who claims to love you be unsettled by your brilliance? It begins with the subtle reframing of your achievements. You receive a promotion, and they wonder aloud if the increased stress will be too much for your temperament. You share a creative project, and they offer a critique so specific that it drains the joy right out of the craft. They aren't trying to crush you. They are trying to keep you at a size that doesn't make them feel quite so small. And then comes the realization that changes everything. You begin to see that you were never meant to thrive within the borders of this relationship. You were invited in to serve as a mirror, a piece of emotional scaffolding designed to hold up a fractured ego. The quiet manipulations, the sighs, the wounded silences, the concerned gaslighting, were never truly about your flaws. They were tools of extraction, used by a person who lacks the internal machinery to generate their own sense of worth. They are using your empathy to fill an internal deficit that has no end. So, how do you begin to walk away from a ghost? The first step isn't a grand confrontation. It is a quiet, internal reclamation of the truth. It is the moment you stop asking for their permission to trust your own senses. You have to listen to that small, persistent frequency in your gut, the one that has been humming, "Something isn't right," while you were busy apologizing for the weather. Your intuition isn't a sign of instability. It is the only part of you that hasn't been colonized by their narrative. But here's the difficult human truth you must face. Their behavior was never actually about you. It was a reflection of an internal void you did not create and cannot fix. You aren't difficult to love. You are simply being loved by someone who is currently incapable of the act. Their inability to see you is a limitation of their sight, not a comment on your visibility. The path out is through narrative sovereignty. This means putting down the script they wrote for you, the one where you are the sensitive one who is lucky to be tolerated. You begin to build a life where your peace is the primary objective, not a byproduct of their temporary approval. You start to set boundaries that might feel like walls to them, but are actually the foundation of your own home. It is time to return to the person you were before you learned to shrink. This process isn't about anger, though anger may come. It is about a profound, quiet clarity. It is about realizing that you don't owe your identity as a sacrifice to someone else's fragility. You are allowed to be whole. You are allowed to exist without an apology attached to your name. The covert narcissist didn't actually steal your light. They simply convinced you that turning it off was the only way to keep them warm. Healing begins the moment you realize the switch was always in your hand. You don't need their validation to shine. You are the source, not the reflection. If these words feel like a mirror to your own experience, know that your perception is valid. You aren't imagining the weight of the silence. Share your journey in the comments. Sometimes the simple act of naming the ghost is the first step toward making it disappear.